For centuries, the Crusades were at the very centre of European and world history, as Christianity waged holy war against the enemies of Christ, or so-called pagans and heretics. Of course, the type of crusade that is most familiar to us today were those fought in the Holy Land. Usually, the crusading era tends to be dated from 1095, when Pope Urban II preached at the Council of Clermont, proposing what would become known as the First Crusade. Urban was responding to a request for support from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos against the menacing Seljuk Turks, who were threatening Alexius's empire. As support for the holy mission grew, Urban made it plain to his crusaders that the task of fighting the infidel would be one full of danger and hardship, but still the support proved to be overwhelming. The First Crusade would be overwhelmingly successful, eventually resulting in the capture of Jerusalem in the name of Christ in the summer of 1099, but there was a dark side to the crusade. Following the capture of Jerusalem, a horrific massacre of the Muslim occupants of the city took place, with crusaders wading through streams of blood, and human heads and limbs could be seen strewn about across the holy city. In the early days of the Crusade, before it had even left Europe, terrible scenes of anti Semitic violence could be seen across Germany and beyond. The basic concept of a crusade may have been rooted in genuine faith and earnest endeavour, but too often they veered towards indiscriminate slaughter. It should be noted that through the crusading era, it was not just Christian armies guilty of such atrocities. With the taking of Jerusalem in 1099, a new era had begun as the Crusaders began to establish themselves in the East, where they would maintain a presence known as the Crusader states for the best part of 2 centuries. Jerusalem itself would be held for 88 years until the emergence of the great Sultan Saladin, who reclaimed it for Islam in 1187, following on from his decisive victory over the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. A few decades later, the Emperor Frederick II would establish a temporary, albeit not total, Christian control over Jerusalem again, but in the mid 1240s, that control would be lost, and in 1291, Acre, the last Christian state in the east, would fall, spelling the end of the Crusader states. Acre had been conquered by Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France a century earlier, during the Third Crusade, which had been launched following Saladin's seizing of Jerusalem. Arguably, the Third Crusade was the second most successful Christian campaign in the Holy Land, the First Crusade being comfortably the most successful. This is an indicator of the overall effectiveness of the Crusades in the East, as the Third Crusade was limited in what it could achieve. Philip, after the taking of Acre, had decided to return home for his own selfish reasons, whilst Richard, with limited manpower, and who had suffered from the effects of a difficult life of campaigning in the Holy Land, realized he would not be able to take Jerusalem, and had to make a truce with Saladin in the hope that he would one day be able to return. However, it was not to be. Other crusades in the East ranged from having little lasting effect to being a complete shambles like the Second Crusade, which ended in disaster at Damascus in 1148. What makes the First Crusade unique is that there were no kings leading the way, instead, only high ranking nobility, and perhaps that's why it succeeded. Even though they had a common goal, it was clear during the Third Crusade that animosity was growing between Philip II and Richard the Lionheart, with Richard well aware that Philip had made his return to France to attack the King of England's Ashanvine Empire. The shambolic Second Crusade had also been led by kings, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, whilst the noble French king, Louis IX, would, during the Seventh Crusade, find himself a captive in Egypt, as his crusade went horribly wrong. It is perhaps unfair to blame these great men for the failures or limitations of the Crusade. They were, after all, extraordinarily difficult expeditions undertaken in very unwelcoming climates and conditions, with a fierce enemy harassing them all the way. For Western Christians, crusades could also be fought closer to home as well. Since the 8th century, Iberia had been under Islamic occupation, and over the centuries, a holy war had been fought on European soil to Christianize what we now know as Spain and Portugal. This war is known as the Reconquista and gave birth to the stories of the legendary El Cid and numerous great Christian rulers, with the most famous being Isabella I of Castile and her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon. With their capture of Granada in 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand had brought the Reconquista to a conclusion, ending over 700 years of Islamic occupation in Iberia. Crusades weren't just a struggle between two opposing religions, but also a Christian thirst for eliminating all forms of paganism and heresy across Europe. In the 13th century, the brutal Albigensian Crusade suppressed the heretical Cathar movement, with leading or unrepentant Cathars being put to fire and sword. Despite this violent oppression, the Cathars would continue to exist even into the following century. Elsewhere, in the far reaches of northern Europe, led by the Teutonic Knights, efforts were made both by force and preaching to Christianize those who remained stubbornly pagan. The history of the Crusades is a remarkable and far reaching tale, from the freezing cold of the Northern Crusades to the violent heat of Jerusalem. One can still imagine the terrifying shrieks of Seljuk Turks piercing the ears of the men of the First Crusade, and what dramatic stories we've taken from these tumultuous events. From Eleanor of Aquitaine creating such scandal during the Second Crusade, to the deeds of her son Richard the Lionheart against his nemesis, the mighty Saladin, we cannot forget the terrible pain and fear felt by the many innocent lost lives during the darkest of days during the Crusades, and the stories of heroism from the Templars who remained steadfast to the very last knockings of the Crusader states in 1291. But even after Acre's fall, the story of the Crusades still had centuries to run.